A high school basketball team went missing after their championship game. But 10 years later, a subway worker makes a shocking discovery. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The scoreboard ticked down to 8 seconds as Jake Matthews dribbled across half court, sweat dripping from his chin onto his blue and gold Riverfall Raptors jersey. The Lancaster Lions defense closed in, their 2-point lead seemingly secure. Jake glanced left, catching Michael Torres's eye, a silent communication built over years of friendship and countless practice sessions. "Come on, Jake," Coach Wilson whispered from the sideline, his usual stoic demeanor cracking under the weight of the moment. In the crowded gym, the collective breath of Riverfall held as Tyler Washington, the tallest player on the court, intercepted a lazy Lions pass. With practiced precision, Tyler launched the ball toward Jake, who caught it at the 3-point line, 3 seconds. Jake squared his shoulders, years of shooting drills crystallizing into this single moment. 2 seconds. The ball left his fingertips in a perfect arc, as the Lancaster defender's outstretched hand missed by millimeters. 1 second. Time seemed to stop as the orange sphere rotated through the air, the buzzer's harsh sound cutting through the gymnasium just as the ball kissed the backboard and fell through the net. 9:47 p.m., March 17, 2013. The State Gymnasium erupted. The scoreboard flashed the final tally. Riverfall 78, Lancaster 77. "We did it!" Brandon Collins screamed, his voice cracking with emotion as he threw himself at his teammates. The 5 starters, Jake, Michael, Brandon, Chris, and Tyler, collapsed into a tight circle at center court, their blue and gold uniforms drenched in sweat and, now, tears of joy. Around them, the crowd transformed into a human whirlpool, pouring onto the court from every direction. Parents, classmates, and townspeople, some who'd lost jobs when the Westbrook plant closed 3 years ago, found momentary salvation in this victory. Coach Wilson, typically reserved at 42, lifted the gleaming trophy alongside his players. His voice, steady despite the chaos, reached the state TV reporter's microphone. "This victory is for all of Riverfall." Martha Collins pushed through the crowd, her eyes never leaving her son. When she reached Brandon, she wrapped him in an embrace that carried 15 years of single motherhood. "Your father would have been so proud," she whispered, as photographers captured the moment, unaware that this image would soon appear on missing person flyers across the state. 20 feet away, Elizabeth Matthews watched her son Jake being hoisted onto his teammates' shoulders. The boy whose father had lost everything when the factory closed had just given everything back to his community, if only for one night. Tears stained Elizabeth's cheeks as she clutched her husband Paul's arm. By 10:30 p.m., the 5 players sat in the makeshift press room, still wearing their game uniforms. Tyler held the trophy while answering questions from local reporters, his usual confidence tempered by disbelief at what they'd accomplished. "We've been playing together since we were kids," Jake explained, his voice hoarse from shouting. "This wasn't just for us, it's for everyone back home who needed something to believe in." During the interview, Michael leaned toward Coach Wilson, whispering something that caused a quick exchange of glances between them. The coach's smile faltered momentarily before he regained his composure. In the locker room at 11:05 p.m., the celebration continued as players changed from their game uniforms into their blue and gold warm-ups. The rhythmic slap of high fives and congratulatory backpats created the soundtrack to their triumph. Coach Wilson closed the door. With a soft click, his expression shifting to something more serious. "Before we head to the lake celebration," he said, his voice low enough that the players instinctively leaned closer, "there's something we need to discuss." Chris Davis, the most reserved of the group, checked his phone with concern, typing a quick message while the others packed their gear. "Is this about what we found?" Brandon asked quietly, carefully tucking a thin notebook into his sports bag. He exchanged a meaningful look with Coach Wilson, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Jake zipped his bag with unnecessary force. "Can't this wait until tomorrow? Everyone's waiting for us at Lake Weston." "It can't," Wilson replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. "What we've discovered that affects everyone in Riverfall, including your families." By 11:12 p.m., the group emerged from the locker room carrying their bags and the trophy. They walked through the empty corridors of the gymnasium while janitors began the mundane task of cleaning up the remnants of Riverfall's greatest sporting triumph. Outside in the partially empty parking lot, Franklin Boyd, the 68-year-old janitor, leaned on his broom watching the champions approach the dark blue Chevrolet Express 2010 van. Coach Wilson loaded the bags into the trunk, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Jake. The boy gestured emphatically, his earlier joy replaced by frustration. "We should tell everyone now," Jake insisted, loud enough for Boyd to overhear. "My dad worked there for 18 years. He deserves to know." "And he will," Wilson countered, placing a firm hand on Jake's shoulder. "But we need to do this right. One wrong move and Reynolds will bury everything." The argument ended abruptly as both noticed Boyd watching them. The 5 players climbed into the van, their faces illuminated briefly by the interior light. Champions one moment, suddenly solemn the next. At 11:15 p.m., Boyd waved as the van prepared to depart. Coach Wilson lowered his window. "Going to make history, Frank," he called out with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Boyd nodded, continuing to sweep as the blue van pulled away from the gymnasium, taillights diminishing into the darkness. He would later tell investigators that something felt off about their departure, the subdued mood contrasting sharply with the victory they'd just achieved. At 11:47 p.m., while parents and friends prepared the bonfire and hung celebration banners at Lake Weston, Brandon sent his final text message, "We're on our way. Get the fire ready." Simultaneously, Tyler posted a selfie on Instagram showing all 5 players, and Coach Wilson with the caption, "Champions heading to celebration. Yasser Riverfall Raptors. Yasser Champions." But something on the dark road between the gymnasium and the lake would ensure that none of them would ever arrive at the celebration they deserved. A cold breeze swept across Lake Weston, rustling the celebratory banners that hung limply between 2 pine trees. The words, "Congratulations, champions," fluttered in the wind, an ironic welcome for guests of honor who would never arrive. The bonfire, meticulously built by Paul Matthews and Richard Torres hours earlier, crackled and spat embers into the night sky, its flames illuminating the anxious faces gathered around it. Sarah Washington glanced at her watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes. "It's 12:30. They should have been here at least an hour ago," she said, turning to Thomas Torres, Michael's father. "Have you tried calling again?" Thomas nodded grimly. "Straight to voicemail, every time." Martha Collins paced near the picnic tables laden with untouched food and drinks. She dialed Brandon's number again, counting each ring before the familiar voice of her son invited her to leave a message. Her irritation had gradually transformed into a gnawing worry. That tightened her chest. "Brandon never ignores my calls," she said to Elizabeth Matthews, who was checking her own phone compulsively, "not even when he's with his friends. Something's wrong." Richard Torres held up his phone, showing the gathered parents the last digital breadcrumb their children had left. Tyler's Instagram post from 11:23. "Look, they were still at the gym then." The image showed the 5 boys and Coach Wilson, their faces flushed with victory, the trophy gleaming in Tyler's hands. The location tag placed them at the state gymnasium, nearly 50 miles away. "Maybe they stopped to celebrate somewhere else first?" Janet Wilson, the coach's wife, suggested half-heartedly. Her voice lacked conviction, knowing how meticulously her husband planned everything. He wouldn't deviate from the plan without notification. By 1:15 a.m., the concern had deepened enough that Paul Matthews grabbed his truck keys. "I'm going to drive the route to the gym. Maybe they had car trouble." His face, weathered by years at the now-closed factory, betrayed the fear he was trying to mask with action. While Paul drove into the darkness, Rachel Davis created a WhatsApp group named "Where Are the Boys?", quickly adding all the parents and several close friends. The messages flew back and forth, each notification sound initially raising hopes before dashing them again. "Could they have taken a different route?" Thomas suggested. There's basically only one way from the gym to here, Janet replied, unless they deliberately went another way. Sarah Washington hunched over her phone, tapping frantically at the Find My iPhone app. Tyler had insisted on sharing his location with her after staying out too late last year. Now the message device offline mocked her maternal vigilance. At 2:05 a.m., headlights cut through the darkness as Paul's pickup returned. He stepped out, shaking his head before anyone could ask. No sign of them on the main road. I checked the gas stations too. Nobody's seen a blue van with 6 passengers. The cold reality settled over the group, like the night fog rolling in from the lake. These weren't rebellious teenagers extending their celebration. These were responsible young men, accompanied by a respected coach. Their collective silence was deafening. Martha Collins, her hands trembling but her voice steady, dialed the Riverfall Police Department. "I need to report missing persons. My son and his friends..." She paused, swallowing back emotion. "No, this isn't normal behavior. They would never do this." At 2:20 a.m., Officer Derek Miller arrived at Lake Weston, his patrol car's headlights sweeping across the gathering. At 34, Miller had spent enough time on Riverfall's police force to recognize when something wasn't right. Despite his initial skeptical expression as he approached with notepad in hand, the collective worry of the families was palpable enough to concern him. "How long exactly have they been missing?" Miller asked, pen poised. "Almost 3 hours since we expected them," Martha replied. "Brandon's last text came at 11:47 p.m. He said they were on their way." Elizabeth Matthews stepped forward, her phone displaying a family tracking app. Michael's phone last pinged near the cell tower on State Road 16, about 8 miles east of the gymnasium. Then nothing. Miller returned to his patrol car, his casual demeanor shifting to professional alertness. "Dispatch, I need 2 units to check State Road 16, approximately 8 miles east of the state gym, looking for a dark blue Chevrolet Express with 6 occupants." By 3:45 a.m., the celebration site had transformed into a vigil. The food remained untouched. The bonfire had dwindled to glowing embers, mirroring the dimming hope. Parents huddled in small groups, some crying quietly, others desperately calling everyone they could think of who might have information. When Officer Miller returned to report that patrol units had found no sign of the van on any of the main routes, Sarah Washington collapsed into her husband's arms, the physical manifestation of the fear they all felt. "We're expanding the search at first light," Miller assured them, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "We'll check all the secondary roads, ditches, everything." As the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky at 5:10 a.m., a caravan of parents' and friends' cars formed behind Officer Miller's patrol vehicle. With daylight approaching, the search could expand beyond the limitations of headlights and flashlights. The parents' faces, haggard from a sleepless night of worry, showed a grim determination. While the sun rose over Riverfall, Sheriff Tom Walker received the call that would transform a local concern into an official missing persons investigation. He listened intently, his coffee forgotten, as Officer Miller detailed the situation. 6 people, the basketball team, state champions yesterday, never showed up for their celebration. The sheriff's free hand balled into a fist. His nephew attended school with these boys. He knew their families. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, unaware that what was beginning as a search for 6 missing people would become one of the most disturbing and controversial investigations in county history, with ramifications reaching into the highest echelons of power in the small town. Sheriff Tom Walker pushed open the glass doors of the Riverfall Police Station at 8:30 a.m., his expression grim as he surveyed the transformation of the normally quiet building. Officers moved with urgency, pinning maps to bulletin boards and answering constantly ringing phones. Walker, a tall man of 53, whose silver-streaked dark hair testified to 20 years of service to the small town, immediately took command. "I want search grids established," Walker instructed, spreading a topographical map across the conference table. "Miller, take 3 deputies and coordinate with State Patrol on the main roads. Johnson, you're responsible for all service roads between the gymnasium and the lake." Deputy Lisa Ramirez approached with a telephone message slip. "Sir, I've contacted the State Department. They're sending canine units, but the helicopter is delayed due to weather in the northern counties." Walker nodded, taking the slip. "6 people don't just vanish without a trace," he said, reaching for the phone. "We need every resource available. These aren't just any missing persons. They're the heart of this community." Across town at Riverfall High School, more than 50 volunteers had gathered in the parking lot by 9:15 a.m. Parents, teachers, and students clutched flashlights and water bottles, many wearing the blue and gold school colors in solidarity. The basketball court, where the team had practiced daily, sat empty, the championship banner already hung in anticipation of the heroes' return. At Coach Wilson's modest 2-story home, Martha Collins and Elizabeth Matthews carefully searched for clues with permission from Janet Wilson, who appeared shell-shocked as she handed over her husband's laptop. "He was acting strange the past week," Janet explained, wringing her hands. "Working late in his office, making phone calls after I went to bed. I thought it was just championship stress." Elizabeth opened the laptop while Martha comforted Janet. The browser history told a disturbing story. Searches for groundwater contamination, hexavalent exposure effects, and illegal chemical waste disposal Westbrook. Most concerning was a search from just 2 days before. Whistleblower protection laws in Pennsylvania. "Janet," Martha asked carefully, "did Robert ever mention concerns about the old factory? About water contamination?" Before Janet could answer, Martha's phone rang. It was Sheriff Walker, requesting their presence at the town hall for a press conference at 2 p.m. The town hall's modest meeting room, normally reserved for sparsely attended council meetings, overflowed with concerned citizens and media by early afternoon. Camera crews from local TV stations jostled for position as Sheriff Walker took the podium, flanked by the visibly distraught families of the missing. "At this time, we are treating this as a missing persons case," Walker announced, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "We have no evidence of an accident on the main road, but we're checking all secondary roads and detours. The last known location was near the cell tower on State Road 16. A reporter raised her hand. "Sheriff, is there any possibility the team decided to celebrate elsewhere before heading to the lake?" Walker's expression hardened. "Knowing Coach Wilson and these boys, that would be completely out of character. We're talking about responsible young men and a respected adult in the community." By mid-afternoon, the investigation hit its first puzzling roadblock. Frank Nelson, the weathered owner of the gas station on the route to the lake, showed investigators his security system interface with blank screens. "Never failed before, I swear," Nelson insisted, gesturing at the monitor that should have shown the road passing his station. "Stopped recording exactly from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. System just came back on by itself." Deputy Johnson noted the coincidence in his report. The time frame aligned perfectly with the team's disappearance. The investigation grew more confusing when conflicting witness reports began trickling in. Diane Mercer, a night shift nurse driving home after her hospital rotation, reported to officers, "I saw a blue van with hazard lights near the entrance to the old Westbrook disposal area around midnight. I thought someone was having car trouble." Meanwhile, across town, Deputy Miller interviewed truck driver Robert Jenkins, who insisted, "I'm certain I saw a blue school-type van heading west on State Road 40 around 12:30. It was driving too fast for that road, caught my attention." The canine units arrived by late afternoon, eager German shepherds straining at their leashes as handlers led them to Michael's last known cell phone location. The dogs tracked a scent for several yards into the wooded area adjacent to the road before losing the trail completely. As evening approached, a new development broke the investigation wide open. Paul Matthews burst into the police station, clutching a school notebook. With such force, his knuckles had turned white. "I found this in Jake's room," he declared, slamming the notebook on Walker's desk. "Look what he was researching for his science project." Walker opened the notebook, revealing detailed notes about environmental impacts of Westbrook Industries on Riverfall and a map marking water collection points throughout the town. One page contained a crude drawing of what appeared to be the old factory's drainage system, with red X's marking specific points. Jake was asking me questions about the old disposal protocols, Paul explained, his voice breaking. Questions about what chemicals we handled on the night shift. I thought it was just for school. By 9 p.m., Walker and his deputies gathered around a large map, marking the contradictory points where the van had allegedly been sighted. The logical routes between these points created a disturbing pattern. All roads somehow connected back to the abandoned Westbrook Industrial Complex. In the Matthews household at 11:30 p.m., Elizabeth lay curled on her son's bed, clutching Jake's basketball jersey to her chest. The gold number 5 gleamed in the dim light as silent tears streamed down her face. The room remained exactly as Jake had left it. Basketball trophies lining the shelves, college. Recruitment letters stacked neatly on the desk, a future full of promise now shrouded in terrifying uncertainty. In the pre-dawn hours of the third day, while Sheriff Walker studied Coach Wilson's search history again, his phone rang with a call that would change the trajectory of the investigation. Howard Reynolds, the powerful mayor and former owner of Westbrook Industries, requested an immediate private meeting about the case. "Tom, there are things about this investigation that need to be managed with discretion," Reynolds said, his normally commanding voice uncharacteristically tense. Sheriff Walker's cruiser crawled up the winding driveway leading to the Reynolds mansion at 7:30 a.m. The Tudor-style home, perched on the highest hill overlooking Riverfall, served as a constant reminder of the family's dominance over the town for generations. Howard Reynolds waited on the sprawling front porch, his silk bathrobe incongruous with the grave situation. "Appreciate you coming so early, Tom," Reynolds said, ushering the sheriff inside without shaking hands. The conversation that followed lasted exactly 45 minutes, though Walker would later struggle to recall specific details when questioned by federal investigators. Back at the station by 8:15 a.m., Walker's demeanor had visibly shifted. He gathered his officers for the morning briefing, his usual methodical approach now tinged with hesitation. "Let's focus our efforts on the main routes and the lake area," Walker instructed, avoiding the curious glances of his deputies. "We don't have resources to chase every wild theory that comes up." Deputy Johnson raised her hand. "Sir, what about those witness reports near the old Westbrook property? Shouldn't we at least check the access roads there?" "Those reports are inconsistent," Walker replied too quickly. "Let's stick to the areas with highest probability first." Across town, Martha Collins and Elizabeth Matthews spread medical records across Martha's kitchen table, piecing together a disturbing pattern neither had previously recognized. "Look at these dates," Martha said, pointing to Brandon's childhood cancer diagnosis at age 8. "Compare them with Jake's leukemia treatment when he was 12. Elizabeth nodded slowly, the color draining from her face as she studied the documents. Michael Torres lost 2 younger siblings to unknown causes when they were toddlers. Martha reached for a town map, circling an area with a red marker. All the boys who got sick lived within this 2-kilometer radius of the old factory, including Michael, whose brothers never made it past their 3rd birthdays. The women exchanged a look of dawning horror. Elizabeth whispered, "Do you think this is connected to their disappearance? To what Coach Wilson was researching?" Around 11:20 a.m., Janet Wilson discovered a physical appointment book in her husband's desk drawer. With trembling fingers, she showed the investigators an entry for March 18th. $10. Morrison, environmental attorney, Lancaster. Officer Derek Miller quickly typed the name James Morrison into the database, discovering a prominent attorney specializing in cases against corporations for environmental crimes. Morrison had successfully represented 3 communities against chemical companies in the past decade, winning settlements totaling over $600 million. He was going to meet with this lawyer the day after the championship, Janet said, her voice hollow with realization. Robert never mentioned any legal consultation to me. The investigation took a volatile turn at 2:30 p.m. when Richard Torres burst into the station, his face contorted with rage and grief. "Why isn't anyone investigating Westbrook?" he shouted, slamming his fist on the front desk. "Michael told me the coach was collecting water samples near the factory. He mentioned something about a school project." "That was bigger than basketball." Sheriff Walker emerged from his office, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Richard, we're following all viable leads. There's no concrete evidence linking the disappearance to the old factory." "That's bullshit, Tom, and you know it," Torres spat back. "You've been in Reynolds' pocket since he bankrolled your first campaign. My son is missing because he knew something." At the public library at 4:15 p.m., Martha and Elizabeth hunched over archived local newspapers, methodically documenting cancer cases reported in Riverfall since the 1990s. The pattern was undeniable. Cancer rates in neighborhoods downriver from the factory were nearly 4 times the national average. Evelyn Parker, a library employee approaching retirement, noticed their research and approached cautiously. "My husband worked at Westbrook for 30 years, she whispered, glancing around nervously. "Died of liver cancer like so many others. Nobody ever really investigated, though many suspected." "Why wouldn't they investigate?" Martha asked. Evelyn's laugh was bitter. "Reynolds owned the only newspaper in town until 2010, owned most of the council members too, one way or another." By early evening, Sheriff Walker discovered a folder hidden in Coach Wilson's office locker at the school gymnasium. Inside were preliminary water analysis results showing alarming levels of industrial chemicals in samples taken from residential areas. Hexavalent chromium levels in one sample, labeled Matthews Residence, were 340 times the EPA limit. Walker stared at the documents, conflict evident in his expression. After several minutes, he reached for his phone and called Mayor Reynolds, rather than sharing the discovery with his team or the families. Tension erupted at 8:30 p.m. during a community meeting at the local church. The gathering had been organized as a prayer vigil, but quickly divided into factions. Some community members demanded authorities investigate the Westbrook connection, while others accused the families of smearing the town's historic main employer with baseless conspiracy theories. Pastor Davis, Chris's father, attempted to mediate. "We are here to pray for our missing children and support their families, not to cast accusations." "Easy for you to say," shouted an unemployed former Westbrook worker. "Your church gets substantial donations from the Reynolds Foundation. Some of us have been sick for years while they buried the evidence." Later that night, Martha arrived at the Torres home with a shoebox she'd found hidden in Brandon's closet. Inside were water samples in small vials, meticulously labeled with dates and locations. "Brandon and Jake were collecting these for months," Martha explained to Richard and his wife. "Coach Wilson must have been helping them analyze the results." While this crucial discovery was being made, Sheriff Walker sat alone in his office, examining the documents he'd found. Between the pages, he noticed a sealed envelope addressed to the FBI in Coach Wilson's handwriting. The envelope had never been mailed. As Martha Collins and Elizabeth Matthews compared the boys' water collection maps with an old Westbrook plumbing diagram they'd unearthed from public archives, news arrived that would change the course of the investigation. A fisherman had just found a blue and gold basketball shoe with the number 7, Michael Torres's number, floating on the surface of a secluded lake within the Reynolds' private property. The discovery of Michael's basketball shoe sent shockwaves through Riverfall. By dawn, search teams had assembled at the edge of the small lake on Reynolds' property, the waterlogged blue and gold Nike high top sealed in an evidence bag. Sheriff Walker stood grimly watching as divers prepared to enter the murky water, their black wetsuits a stark contrast to the pristine surroundings of the Reynolds estate. Howard Reynolds approached, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit despite the early hour and muddy terrain. His face, usually composed for public appearances, showed agitation as he confronted Walker. "You have a warrant for this specific area, Tom, not for my entire property," Reynolds said, gesturing to the papers in Walker's hand. "I want to help find these boys, but there are limits to what you can legally do here. The sheriff's response was cut short by the arrival of Howard's attorney, James Whitaker, who immediately began documenting which officers were present and what areas they were accessing. The standoff continued until 10:30 a.m., when both men left for the county courthouse. Inside Judge Harrison's chambers, Sheriff Walker argued for an expanded search warrant. "Your Honor, finding the shoe here is probable cause to search the entire property and adjacent industrial areas." Whitaker countered smoothly, "The shoe could have drifted from upstream. There's no evidence suggesting these boys were ever on Mr. Reynolds' property. The environmental risks of allowing untrained personnel to search former industrial zones are substantial." Judge Harrison sighed, removing his glasses. "Motion denied, Sheriff. The evidence presented is circumstantial for justifying such a broad search on private property. Stick to the areas specified in your current warrant." On the courthouse steps following the ruling, Whitaker addressed the gathered reporters with practiced confidence. "The Reynolds family is fully cooperating within legal boundaries and is as interested in finding the missing teenagers as everyone else in our community." By early afternoon, a new element entered the increasingly complex investigation. A black SUV with government plates pulled up in front of the Riverfall Police Station at 1:45 p.m. Agent Sandra Mitchell emerged, her dark suit and confident posture immediately marking her as federal law enforcement. She carried a thick folder under her arm as she strode purposefully into the building. In Walker's office, Mitchell wasted no time on pleasantries after presenting her credentials. "The envelope Coach Wilson attempted to send us contained serious allegations about illegal toxic waste dumping affecting his students' health. Why wasn't this reported to the FBI immediately upon discovery, Sheriff?" Walker shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Mitchell examined the investigation map pinned to his wall, her eyes narrowing at the areas marked in red as off-limits. "These restricted zones align perfectly with the locations Wilson documented in his water testing," she observed. "Don't you find that suspicious, Sheriff?" Walker cleared his throat. "Agent Mitchell, we have protocols to follow. Those areas require special authorization due to potential environmental hazards, or due to political considerations," Mitchell replied coolly. Across town at 4:30 p.m., the families gathered in the Davis living room, watching national news coverage of what the media had dubbed the missing starters. The story had captured public imagination, 5 state champions and their coach vanishing on the night of their greatest triumph. Sarah Washington, whose husband's pharmacy provided the family with greater financial resources than the others, leaned forward. "We need our own investigator," she proposed firmly, "someone with no connections to Reynolds or this town, someone who can't be intimidated." Martha Collins nodded grimly. "The sheriff is dragging his feet on key evidence. Did you notice they haven't searched any of the areas where our boys collected water samples?" That evening, Agent Mitchell sat across from Janet Wilson at the kitchen table of the coach's home. "Did your husband mention receiving any threats in the weeks before the disappearance?" she asked gently. Janet wiped her eyes, then rose, abruptly, and walked to a bookshelf. "I found this hidden between his books," she said, returning with an envelope. "It arrived a week before the championship. No return address." Mitchell carefully removed the contents. A photograph of the 5 players during practice with the words, "Some secrets should stay buried," written in red ink on the back. The agent's expression remained neutral, but her hands tightened imperceptibly around the evidence. By 9 p.m., Walker confronted Howard Reynolds in his office at City Hall, the tension between old loyalties and professional duty evident in his stance. "Howard, if you know anything about these boys, you'd better tell me now. The FBI is involved. This is beyond our control." Reynolds poured whiskey into 2 glasses, sliding one toward the sheriff. "Tom, you grew up here. You know how much Riverfall depends on my family's reputation. Don't let some outside agent destroy everything with conspiracy theories." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Think about your pension, Tom. Think about your brother's construction contracts with the city." In her hotel room at 11:30 p.m., Agent Mitchell had transformed the walls into an investigation board. Photos of the missing boys were connected with red string to their medical histories, house, locations, and Westbrook Industries operations. She studied the pattern emerging, particularly the cluster of childhood illnesses within the specific radius of the factory's drainage system. Her phone rang. A former Westbrook employee had finally agreed to speak about night operations at the factory during the years when all 5 missing boys had experienced health issues. They arranged to meet at an abandoned hunting cabin outside town limits at 2 a.m., the man insisting on extreme secrecy. The following morning, as Mitchell drove along the deserted State Road 16 toward the secret meeting, her headlights illuminated a black pickup truck parked on the shoulder ahead. As she slowed, the truck suddenly accelerated directly toward her vehicle. Mitchell swerved sharply, but the larger vehicle clipped her rear bumper, sending her car into an uncontrolled spin toward the embankment. The last thing she saw before impact was the truck's driver, face obscured by a ski mask, deliberately turning to ram her again, making it clear that someone in Riverfall was willing to do anything to keep certain secrets buried. The black pickup truck sped away into the darkness as Agent Mitchell's sedan rolled twice before coming to rest upside down in the roadside ditch. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, her heartbeat thundering in her ears as she fumbled for her phone with trembling fingers. The screen was cracked but functional, and she managed to dial through blurred vision. "This is Agent Mitchell," she gasped into the phone, her voice surprisingly steady despite the circumstances. "I need immediate backup. Someone just tried to kill me on State Road 16, about 12 miles east of Riverfall." Within 30 minutes, the crash site transformed into a crime scene. Emergency lights pulsed in the pre-dawn darkness as federal technicians collected paint fragments from Mitchell's damaged vehicle. Sheriff Walker arrived, his expression oscillating between professional concern and visible discomfort when Mitchell fixed him with an accusatory stare. "This happened immediately after I informed only you about my meeting," she said, wincing as a paramedic applied a butterfly bandage to her forehead. "Explain that, Sheriff." Walker's face paled. "You can't possibly think I had anything to do with this." "What I think," Mitchell replied, "is that information is leaking from your department directly to whoever wants this investigation buried." By sunrise, the FBI's presence in Riverfall had escalated dramatically. The conference room of the town's only hotel transformed into an operations center by 9:30 a.m. Additional agents arrived hourly, setting up surveillance equipment and establishing secure communications. The message was clear. The attempted murder of a federal agent had elevated the case to a top priority. While Mitchell received medical attention, a team of agents converged on the abandoned cabin where she'd planned to meet her informant. They found Edward Gaines, a 59-year-old former Westbrook employee, hiding in a storage closet, visibly terrified. His hands shook so violently that he spilled water down his shirt when they offered him a drink. In a secure room at 11:45 a.m., Gaines finally began to talk. "I worked in the disposal sector for 22 years, he said, clutching his water cup. "Every Wednesday and Friday night they ordered us to dump the special material directly into channels leading to the eastern sector's groundwater." Mitchell spread a map on the table between them. "This eastern sector includes the homes of the Matthews, Collins, and Torres families?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Gaines nodded solemnly. The company knew exactly which neighborhoods would be affected. They had computer models showing the flow patterns. Reynolds personally signed off on the protocols. Across town, Sheriff Walker sat alone in his patrol car playing back a recording he'd secretly made during his last conversation with Reynolds. The mayor's voice came through clearly. "If those documents from Wilson's investigation ever surface, we'll all go down, you included, Tom. Remember who approved those disposal permits as county commissioner before you became sheriff." Walker rested his forehead against the steering wheel, the weight of complicity crushing him. His phone buzzed with a text from Agent Mitchell. "We have Gaines. He's talking. Last chance to pick the right side of history, Sheriff." At 3:30 p.m., the five families gathered at Washington Pharmacy after closing hours. The back office had been transformed into an investigation hub by Ronald Webb, a 54-year-old former Chicago detective with a reputation for solving cases others couldn't or wouldn't. His salt and pepper beard and permanent scowl gave him the appearance of a man perpetually dissatisfied with the world. The Westbrook obtained expansion licenses for the industrial repository exactly one day after the disappearance, Webb explained, pointing to documents spread across the table. Construction began immediately, without the mandatory environmental inspections. Sarah Washington nodded grimly. They were covering something up, literally. Martha Collins stood, addressing the group with quiet determination. We need to formalize our alliance. Together, we'll have more strength to pressure authorities and the media. I'm calling it Truth for Our Sons, Elizabeth Matthews said, displaying a logo she'd designed on her tablet, 5 basketball jerseys, hanging side by side against a blue background. By early evening, the tension in Riverfall reached a breaking point. Agent Mitchell led an FBI team into Reynolds' office at City Hall, armed with a federal warrant. All Westbrook Industries records from 1990 to 2013, she announced coolly, immediately. Howard Reynolds maintained his practiced composure even as federal agents began boxing documents. Some of those records were unfortunately lost in a fire. As for the rest, my attorneys need to review what falls within the scope of your warrant. Mitchell stepped closer, her voice low enough that only Reynolds could hear. We have Gaines on record about the night operations. We have Walker's recordings. Your wall of silence is crumbling, Mr. Mayor. For the first time in the investigation, a flicker of genuine fear crossed Reynolds's face. At 9:00 p.m., the families held an impromptu press conference in front of the local church. Martha Collins stood flanked by the other parents, facing a row of cameras that included national news networks. Today, we announce the formation of Truth for Our Sons, she declared, her voice steady despite her grief. We demand a full investigation into both the disappearance of our children and the environmental crimes that may have led to it. While the alliance of families gained momentum and the federal net tightened, an accidental discovery changed everything. Municipal workers performing routine maintenance on a sewage duct near the former Westbrook Industrial Complex uncovered a twisted piece of metal with traces of navy blue paint and part of a license plate that matched Coach Wilson's vehicle. The twisted piece of metal, pulled from the sewage duct, sent ripples through Riverfall like a stone dropped into still water. Forensic technicians confirmed what everyone already suspected. The navy blue paint matched the exact shade and composition used on Chevrolet Express vans, manufactured in 2010, and the partial license plate number aligned with Coach Wilson's vehicle registration. By sunrise the next day, heavy machinery rumbled toward the former Westbrook Industries drainage system. Operators in full environmental protection suits guided excavators into position while FBI agents supervised every movement. The site transformation, from abandoned industrial zone to major forensic operation, happened with military precision, reflecting the case's elevated priority following the attack on Agent Mitchell. From the tinted windows of his luxury sedan parked on a nearby hilltop, Howard Reynolds observed the operation through binoculars, his phone pressed to his ear. They can't possibly have enough for a warrant this extensive, he hissed to someone on the other end. Call Judge Peterson immediately. I don't care if he's on vacation. At the excavation site, Mitchell and Walker examined the metal fragment under the morning light. The color match is exact, Mitchell noted, comparing it to photos of Coach Wilson's van. And these partial numbers align with the plate. This wasn't randomly discarded debris. Something deliberately destroyed this vehicle. By mid-morning, the excavator revealed a set of underground pipelines not documented on official maps provided by Westbrook. Forensic technicians photographed each stage of the process, creating a meticulous record that would later prove crucial in court proceedings. The emotional toll on the families intensified with each new discovery. At 1:15 p.m., Rachel Davis arrived at the excavation site, her eyes wild with desperation. Before anyone could stop her, she ducked under the security tape and ran toward the open pit. "I can feel Chris calling me," she screamed as officers gently restrained her. "He's down there. I can feel him." Martha Collins rushed to comfort her, wrapping protective arms around Rachel's trembling shoulders. As they stood watching the operation, a forensic technician carefully lifted a piece of blue and gold fabric from a newly excavated section of the duct. The synthetic material, though dirty and damaged, was immediately recognizable as part of a Riverfall Raptors warm-up uniform. Within hours, the FBI had established a mobile laboratory on site. A technician in white coveralls confirmed what the families had already recognized. This fabric matches the Riverfall Raptors warm-up uniforms. Preliminary tests show traces of bodily fluids consistent with human blood. As the sun began to set, the Truth for Our Sons organization held their planned vigil on the school's outdoor basketball court. Hundreds of people gathered, holding candles that flickered like stars against the deepening twilight. National news cameras captured the scene as Elizabeth Matthews addressed the crowd, her voice steady despite her pain. "We don't just want to find our sons," she declared. "We want the truth about what happened to them and to our community over decades of corporate negligence and corruption." While the community gathered in solidarity, Sheriff Walker was conducting a crucial interview across town. Gregory Phillips, former operations manager at Westbrook, had finally agreed to speak under immunity protection. The executives knew about the cancer clusters since 1997, Phillips confessed, avoiding Walker's gaze. They had internal studies directly linking them to our disposal practices. Reynolds himself received quarterly health impact reports that never went public. The investigation accelerated on multiple fronts. At 8:30 p.m., Ronald Webb discovered municipal records showing that the industrial repository area had received an express authorization for urgent containment work, signed by Mayor Reynolds on the morning of March 18th, mere hours after the team's disappearance. "Look at the timestamp," Webb pointed out to Martha Collins when she arrived at his office. This was processed at 6:42 a.m., before any missing persons report was even filed. Reynolds was securing this area before anyone knew the boys were missing. In her temporary office, Agent Mitchell received the first laboratory results from water samples collected in the excavation area. The levels of contaminants measured 240 times above legal limits, with particularly high concentrations of chemicals linked to the rare forms of cancer that had affected Jake Matthews and Brandon Collins years earlier. The psychological impact on the families deepened as the investigation uncovered more disturbing connections. In her home at 11 p.m., Rachel Davis sat alone in Chris's bedroom, surrounded by photos, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn maps she'd created. The walls, once decorated with basketball posters, now resembled a disturbing investigation board as Rachel murmured about messages she believed she was receiving from her son. Martha Collins sought solace in a different way. Sitting on Brandon's bed, she held his journal, rereading the final entry written on the morning of the championship. "Today we play not just for the title, but for everyone Westbrook has harmed. Coach says we have enough evidence now." The excavation continued through the night under powerful floodlights, the machinery's low rumble, a constant reminder of the grim work underway. Just after midnight, the operation reached a deeper section when an excavator operator suddenly signaled for everyone to stop. The beam from his equipment had illuminated what appeared to be the crushed roof of a blue van, buried almost 30 meters below the surface. When the first images of the partially excavated van reached the family's phones through an FBI agent who had promised to keep them informed, Sarah Washington fainted immediately, but Martha Collins remained strangely calm, saying only, "Now we need to know who gave the order," unaware that the evidence that would answer that question had been hidden for 10 years in a location no one had ever thought to investigate. The recovery of the van began with excruciating precision. Forensic teams in hazmat suits worked in carefully timed shifts, the site secured behind multiple layers of barriers and armed FBI agents. Every shovelful of contaminated soil was sifted and catalogued, each piece of debris photographed in situ before removal. The operation resembled an archaeological dig more than a crime scene investigation, a meticulous unearthing of a modern tragedy buried in toxic soil. Dr. Judith Patel, the lead forensic pathologist dispatched from the FBI's Quantico laboratory, addressed the families on the second morning of excavation. "We're proceeding with extreme caution," she explained, her voice gentle but clinical. "The chemical environment has likely accelerated decomposition, but it may have also preserved certain evidence. This process will take at least 48 hours. Martha. Collins nodded stoically, while Sarah Washington clutched her husband's arm for support. Richard Torres stared at the distant excavation, his face a mask of controlled rage. Only the Davis family was absent. Pastor Davis had accompanied his wife Rachel to Riverfall Memorial Hospital after her complete nervous breakdown the previous day. "She hasn't slept in almost a week," Pastor Davis explained to Martha over the phone. "The doctors had to sedate her. She keeps talking about Chris trying to tell her where to find the final proof." By afternoon, laboratory technicians were analyzing fragments recovered from around the van, including 9-meter bullet casings that matched no registered firearms in the Riverfall Police Department. The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing persons case to a confirmed homicide, sending shockwaves through the community. Sheriff Walker, his own culpability weighing heavily, confronted Howard Reynolds in the mayor's office with a warrant in hand. "I have an arrest warrant, Howard," he said, the paper trembling slightly in his grip. "Multiple witnesses have testified about your direct involvement in the order to concrete that specific area on March 18th. Reynolds' lawyer intervened before the mayor could respond, but the exchange was captured by surveillance cameras Agent Mitchell had authorized. The footage later revealed Reynolds whispering to Walker, "You're going down with me if you do this, Tom." That evening, Martha Collins retreated to Brandon's bedroom, obsessively re-examining his notebooks and belongings, as she had countless times before. This time, however, she paused at a page she'd previously overlooked, a detailed drawing of what appeared to be a tunnel system with a central chamber marked with an X. The diagram meant nothing to Martha until she recalled Brandon's fascination with the old mining tunnels beneath Riverfall. "He used to explore abandoned places with his friends," she told Webb when she called him to share her discovery. "Said they were mapping the forgotten history of the town." At a press conference that evening, Agent Mitchell confirmed the grim discovery to the gathered media. "We have recovered evidence consistent with multiple homicides, including blood samples from different individuals and evidence of gunfire inside the vehicle." While national attention focused on the excavation site, Martha showed Webb her son's drawings. "Brandon was obsessed with the old mining tunnels under the city," she explained. "And look here, he marked a specific area that now lies beneath the new subway. Construction to Lancaster." Webb immediately accessed the subway construction plans, noting with suspicion that the initial route had been mysteriously altered to completely avoid the area Brandon had marked. "This deviation added millions to the construction budget," Webb observed. "No clear engineering reason was ever documented for the change." Meanwhile, at the excavation site, the recovery team finally extracted the van completely, revealing bullet impacts along the driver's side door and blood stains preserved by the anaerobic environment created by the quick-setting concrete. The vehicle's identification numbers confirmed it was Coach Wilson's van, eliminating any lingering doubts about the fate of the missing six. Inside the van's mangled interior, technicians discovered a waterproof container wedged beneath the rear seat. Agent Mitchell carefully opened it in the mobile laboratory, revealing a folder containing detailed records of contamination and internal Westbrook studies on disease rates in the community. These documents, which Coach Wilson had intended to deliver to the environmental attorney in Lancaster, provided the first conclusive evidence linking Westbrook Industries directly to the health crisis in Riverfall. The following morning, Martha and Webb met with Ray Donovan, a maintenance worker at the subway construction site who had known Brandon. "Yeah, the kid came around often, fascinated by the tunnels," Donovan confirmed. "I showed him an old mining map we found during the initial surveys, stuff that predates any official city records." Donovan glanced nervously over his shoulder before continuing. "Found something strange down there a few months back, never reported it officially, didn't know what to make of it until I saw your son's face on the news." By mid-morning, Donovan had led Martha and Webb through a maintenance access point into the subway system, navigating through a secondary tunnel that, according to him, doesn't appear on the official construction maps. They moved in silence, their flashlight beams cutting through the underground darkness, until they reached a chamber that made Martha's blood run cold. 5 basketball jerseys hung from a crude wooden structure like a macabre memorial, each bearing the name and number of one of the missing players. Covered in a decade's worth of dust but otherwise perfectly preserved, the blue and gold uniforms created an eerie shrine in the underground darkness. In the center of the underground memorial, Martha found a waterproof notebook carefully sealed in a plastic container. Her hands trembled as she opened the first page and recognized Coach Wilson's handwriting. The first words sent a chill through her entire body. "If you're reading this, I'm probably dead, along with my boys, and it's important the world knows this wasn't an accident, but an execution directly ordered by Howard Reynolds when he discovered what we knew." Martha clutched Coach Wilson's journal with trembling hands, its pages providing the concrete evidence they had sought for a decade. The underground memorial had preserved not only the physical tokens of the missing boys, but also the detailed account of their final hours. Martha passed the journal to Agent Mitchell, who quickly scanned the first few entries, her professional composure momentarily cracking. "This details everything," Mitchell said. "Wilson documented not just the environmental investigation they conducted, but also the threats they received in the weeks before the championship." The journal described in painstaking detail how Wilson had grown increasingly concerned about the unusual health patterns among current and former players. His entries chronicled collecting water and soil samples from neighborhoods where multiple Riverfall students had developed rare cancers, and how he'd enlisted the help of his 5 starting players in documenting evidence after Jake Matthews shared his own research. Wilson's final entry, written hours before the championship game, contained a chilling revelation. "Anonymous call this morning. Male voice. Said they knew about the samples and documents. Warned that accidents happen easily to young athletes celebrating. After today's win, we can't wait any longer. Told the boys everything in the locker room. They deserve to know what's happening to their bodies, their families. We decided together that after the lake celebration, we'll drive straight to Lancaster to meet Attorney Morrison. I've hidden backup evidence in a place only Brandon knows, just in case." Back at the FBI Command Center, Mitchell used the journal and memorial evidence to intensify pressure on Roger Bennett, the former Westbrook security director who had been detained for questioning. Facing multiple charges and potential life imprisonment, Bennett finally agreed to a plea deal. "I'll tell you everything," Bennett said, his voice hollow as cameras recorded his statement. "But I want immunity from capital charges." His testimony, videotaped over a 6-hour session, described in horrifying detail what happened that night. Reynolds got a call from a factory employee who overheard Wilson talking to the players in the locker room about evidence they'd collected. Reynolds panicked. "He called me around 11:30, said I needed to handle a situation that threatened the company's existence." Bennett stared at his hands as he continued. He didn't specify how, but made it clear they couldn't reach that lawyer in Lancaster. Said if the town discovered what the factory had done, it would destroy everything. The former security director described how he and 4 factory security guards intercepted Coach Wilson's van on an isolated stretch of road, using a vehicle to force them to pull over. The plan was just to confiscate the documents and intimidate Wilson into silence, Bennett claimed, visibly distressed even years later. "But Wilson recognized Peterson, one of our security guys who used to work at the factory. The boys started recording with their phones. Things escalated fast." Bennett's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. Brandon tried to run with a folder. Shots were fired. The coach and two of the boys were hit. After that, there was no going back. Bennett described how they transported the van with the bodies to the waste repository that was being illegally expanded that week. The van was pushed into a deep pit of chemical waste, and the area was quickly concreted over during the following 48 hours, with falsified records concealing the operation. With Bennett's testimony secured, arrests moved swiftly. Howard Reynolds was detained at the regional airport while attempting to board a private jet to a country with no extradition treaty with the U.S. His son Thomas, who had directed factory operations in 2013, was arrested at his vacation home in Colorado. Sheriff Walker, facing evidence of his own complicity, agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency. Forensic experts working around the clock recovered a partially preserved phone from among the van's debris. Technicians managed to extract a 17-second audio recording of the confrontation. The families gathered in the evidence room listened in stunned silence to Coach Wilson's voice. "Run, boys. Brandon, take the folder." Followed by sounds of struggle and what technicians identified as 2 gunshots. For the families, confirmation of their children's deaths, though devastating, brought a form of long-needed closure. "For 10 years, I've looked at every tall young man on the street, wondering if it could be my son," Sarah Washington told reporters, her voice breaking. "Now at least I know he's not suffering somewhere, thinking we abandoned him." Elizabeth Matthews visited Paul Matthews at the hospital where he received treatment for terminal cancer. She showed him photos of the underground memorial, tears streaming down both their faces. They weren't forgotten, Paul, and the truth is finally coming out. The most damning evidence came from Bennett's detailed account of each victim's fate. "Jake and Michael tried to fight. They were shot inside the van," he testified, unable to meet Martha Collins' eyes as she watched from the viewing room. "The coach tried to protect the others and was also hit. Brandon ran with the folder, but Peterson caught him about 30 yards from the van." Martha watched the testimony without tears now, only iron determination, as she listened to the final moments of her son's life. Every word burned into her memory. Fuel for the justice she would ensure came to fruition. At a national press conference the following day, Agent Mitchell formally announced, "We have conclusive evidence of multiple premeditated homicides, a 2-decade conspiracy to cover up criminal environmental contamination, and a wide network of obstruction of justice involving public officials at every level." The next morning, as the first remains were officially identified through DNA testing and families finally began planning long-delayed funerals, a disturbing discovery was made in Howard Reynolds' private office. A meticulously organized collection of personal items he had collected from each victim after the murders, including the championship medals that should have been with the bodies, but had somehow become macabre trophies for the man who ordered their deaths. Martha Collins stood before her bedroom mirror on the morning of March 17, 2028, carefully pinning a brooch bearing Brandon's photo to her lapel. 15 years had passed since the championship game that changed everything. Her once dark hair had turned completely gray, but her eyes retained the determined spark that had carried her through a decade of searching and 5 years of fighting for justice. Outside her window, Riverfall looked nothing like the declining industrial town it had been when Brandon disappeared. The settlement money had transformed the landscape. New parks replaced contaminated lots. Modern medical facilities served residents still suffering from exposure, and the Riverfall Environmental Research Center stood where the Westbrook Waste Repository had once leaked poison into the community's groundwater. Across town, Elizabeth Matthews made final preparations at the Toxic Exposure Survivors Health Center she now directed. The facility, funded by the $1.2 billion settlement against Westbrook Holdings, would officially open after today's memorial dedication. She straightened a framed photo of Jake on her desk, her son smiling in his basketball uniform, frozen forever at 17. "The last patients will transfer from the old building this afternoon," her assistant confirmed. Elizabeth nodded, touching Jake's photo briefly before gathering her notes for the speech she would deliver alongside Martha. Richard Torres, sober for 4 years after battling alcoholism in the wake of Michael's death, meticulously polished the state championship trophy that would be permanently housed in the new memorial. His hands, once unsteady from grief and drinking, moved with purpose across the golden surface, removing every fingerprint and speck of dust. "They earned this twice over," he murmured to his wife, who sat quietly beside him. "Once on the court, and once by standing up for the truth." At the entrance to the community center, Sarah Washington supervised the installation of 5 bronze silhouettes in basketball uniforms, alongside a statue of Coach Wilson holding a document folder. The memorial had been her design, faceless figures representing not just her son Tyler and his teammates, but all victims of corporate environmental negligence. By 11:00 a.m., the gymnasium, now renamed Champions Arena, filled to capacity. 5 empty chairs sat at center court, each draped with the preserved original jerseys of the players. Television cameras from national networks lined the walls, chronicling how Riverfall had transformed tragedy into a beacon for environmental justice. On screens around the arena, a video montage showed the town's transformation, contaminated areas being remediated, new trees planted along formerly barren streets, the expanded hospital, and children playing in a park constructed where the industrial depot once stood. The images told a story of rebirth from the ashes of unimaginable loss. At 12:30 p.m., Martha approached the podium, surrounded by the other families, state officials, and the FBI agents who had finally brought them justice. The crowd fell silent as she adjusted the microphone. "My son and his friends didn't die just for a trophy," Martha began, her voice steady and clear. "They died trying to save their community, their families, their friends. They didn't know they were risking their lives that night, but they knew they were fighting for something bigger than themselves." In the front row, Paul Matthews listened from his wheelchair, an oxygen tank at his side, his body ravaged by the cancer that had resulted from decades of exposure during his employment at Westbrook. He gripped Elizabeth's hand, tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "Coach Wilson could have delivered those documents alone, in secret," Martha continued. "But he chose to share the truth with these young men, recognizing it was their lives, their future. Together, they made a choice that, although it cost their lives, ended up saving countless others." After the ceremony, Agent Mitchell, now head of the FBI's Environmental Crimes Division, visited the original underground memorial, preserved exactly as they had found it. The chamber had become an unofficial museum, accessible only by special permission, a stark reminder of the lengths to which ordinary people will go to expose the truth. Later that afternoon, the current Riverfall High School basketball team took the court for their annual commemorative game. Instead of the traditional blue and gold, they wore white uniforms, each bearing the name of one of the starters on the back. The white jerseys, the new coach had explained, represented the truth finally brought to light, and the purity of a sacrifice that, though unintentional, had forever transformed a community. Throughout Riverfall, evidence of healing appeared everywhere. At the new health center, medical staff examined a young child, while behind them, a chart displayed the dramatic decline in cancer rates and other diseases since the environmental remediation began. Streets once lined with foreclosure signs now showcased renovated homes and thriving businesses. As evening approached, Martha visited the cemetery, walking slowly through what locals now called the Champions Garden, where the 6 were buried side by side. She placed fresh flowers on each gravestone, lingering longest at Brandon's. Janet Wilson, the coach's widow, joined Martha as twilight descended. She showed Martha a newly published book based on her husband's journals that had helped transform environmental laws in several states. "Robert always said these boys would change the world," Janet said softly. "And they did. Just not the way we imagined." As darkness fell over Riverfall, The town glowed with new life. From an aerial view, lights began twinkling across the revitalized community, with 5 perpetual flames at the community center entrance, one for each player, burning constantly, visible from any point in town as a permanent reminder. In her office at the Environmental Research Center, Martha Collins closed her personal journal that she had maintained for 15 years. Since Brandon's disappearance, the final entry simply read, "We finally completed the game you started that night, my son. Final score, truth 78, lies 77. You won in the last second, just like in that championship."